In this video, I will offer an argument for the likely truth of Christianity called the likely divine action argument. This argument is a partially a priori argument for Christianity. This argument is not unique, as there are other partially a priori arguments for Christianity that argue similarly, but the way I frame the argument I think is more effective. But check out the other versions as well that I linked in the descriptions, in particular Thomistic Disputation's version, which this is the most similar to. The argument then goes like this. If God exists, then God would have the highest level of empathy for mankind, which entails God carrying out all feasible acts of empathy towards mankind. Becoming incarnate and suffering for mankind's sins is a feasible act of empathy God could exercise towards mankind, and therefore God would act in this way. If God would become incarnate and suffer for mankind's sins, then Christianity is likely true. Therefore, if God exists, then Christianity is likely true. Now, this argument is, of course, ultimately directed to someone who finds it likely that God exists. I won't be defending the claim that God exists in this video, but I have elsewhere. Premise 1 of the argument seems intuitively plausible because God would be expected to act towards creatures in a morally considerate, empathetic way. The problems of evil and hiddenness seem to work under the assumption that God would act in such a manner, so premise 1 seems pretty plausible. Premise 2 is of course debatable, but it does seem quite plausible that becoming human and suffering for mankind's sins would represent one of the most empathetic kinds of actions. There are of course objections that can be made to this point. The main one is that we cannot know what God would necessarily do because the rationale for God's choices would be beyond our understanding. That has been my main hesitation in accepting an argument like this, but in response, I agree that we cannot know the entire rationale for all of God's choices, but that does not mean that we cannot draw general conclusions about what God would be likely to do. There are, of course, circumstances that we may expect God to respond differently, such as in preventing suffering, but I think a plausible explanation can be presented as to why God does not prevent suffering, as I have argued for elsewhere, so I think premise 2 is plausible. Premise 3 seems true because Christianity is the only major worldview that teaches that God became incarnate and suffered for mankind's sins. But it is of course possible that another worldview could make the same claim. However, the plausibility of that worldview would then need to be assessed. We would need to compare the data of its savior figure that the religion claims is God incarnate and see if that figure is as seemingly morally impressive as Jesus is seen to be in the Gospels. The conclusion of the argument then follows. There are likely other objections that can be made to the argument, but I hope you found it interesting and thanks for watching.